let's take a look at this image, which is grayscale. In this grayscale image that was tinted with a blue-yellow tint. So we have a blue in the shadows and a yellowish tint in the highlights. If I go into the yellows and I add a great deal of saturation to the yellows, in other words, much more than we see in the blues, then the image loses its equilibrium. It loses the balance between the faded tint of the blues in the shadows and that originally previous faded tint of yellows in the highlights, and it just doesn't look as appealing. And if I take that to an extreme, you can see that it looks obviously surreal. You wouldn't want to oversaturate the image, but even if I pull that back a little bit, we lose that equilibrium. Whereas if I turn that off and we have that yellow, I think you instantly have that feeling that it's easier on the eye. You just need that little bit of yellow balancing out that little bit of blue. Hue contrast, opposites on the color wheel, but similar saturations, and they work very well. We've talked about luminance or brightness contrast and hue and saturation contrast. Luminance or brightness contrast are extreme differences of lights and darks in an image. Hue contrast would be color opposites on the color wheel, or near opposites, colors that are very far from each other as opposed to colors that are close to each other on the color wheel, which wouldn't have a lot of hue contrast. Saturation contrast would be colors that are different in saturation. So if you have one color in an image that is greatly saturated and another color that isn't very saturated, you have a great deal of saturation contrast. Any of these kinds of contrast can work for you or against you, and you have to be careful. It may depend on the colors that you're using, where they are in your image, or how much of those colors are in your image. And they can evoke different responses in your viewers. If you have a lot of hue contrast and saturation in your image, as well as brightness contrast, you could have a very edgy image that would evoke a very edgy response in your viewer. Whereas if you have hues that are similar and introduce saturation contrast, or hues that are opposites on the color wheel, have a great deal of hue contrast, but reduce the saturation contrast, you can end up with an image that is very romantic or evokes a very soothing response in the viewer.